Thank you everybody for being here. It's definitely a pleasure to follow my colleagues in this panel. So my presentation here is going to be a little bit different in the sense that I will show too many numbers, and maybe there are too many. So if I can't really explain all of them in detail and you have any questions, please come after the presentation. I will be more than happy to share all the numbers and even more details into all that. My presentation is going to be related about domestic support. This is a work we've been doing with David Laborde and Joe Glauber, and it will be published in a book at the end of the year, so touch with that. And again, I just want to start this presentation giving it some context to the idea of domestic support, and this is a slide that it will actually add something that Joe already showed earlier today, but just to show again that developing countries have been increasing their share in global trade. This goes for the export side and the import side. If we see the exports, we can see that the rest of the world and China has been increasing their exports, and in terms of the imports, the rest of the world and Brazil, and if we look at the imports, it will be the rest of the world and China. The other piece of information we need to look at before we can actually jump into any kind of possible scenarios for what's the future for domestic support in the world and their impact in developing countries will be to see what are we doing right now, what's the world doing in terms of domestic support. So this slide shows the overall trade distorting support measure that the WTO has. It's measured in billions of dollars. This measurement takes into account the AMS, the minimis, the Article 6.2, and as well the blue box. In the top row, we can see the developed countries, and in the bottom one is the developing countries. If we look at the first developed countries, we can see that the trend they have is pretty much consistent, except with the EU, but in the last couple of years, but that was a process that they did with their own political changes. But since then, in 2013, if we look, we can see that actually they have around $14 billion in OTDS. The US will have something similar, which is 13.6, and then Japan will have around 11. If we look at developing countries, their story is totally different. We can actually see that they've been increasing the expenditures in OTDS in the last years. If we look at China, for example, we can see that in the last year they reported, which is 2010, they have $18 billion. And India has 31. However, it's a very special case because almost all that support is given to under the Article 6.2. So we will see later that how that changes a little bit this story. If we see the same measurement, but now as percentage of total value of production, we can see that it's kind of the same story, but the ranking of the countries changed a little bit. If we look at this, now Japan will be the one that gives the most support with 11%, followed by the US and the European Union. And then if we look at developing countries, something to notice is that now China, you see the numbers that are totally comparable to Brazil, which is around 2%. That is given the size of the value of production that China has. What seeing the same thing is how much per capita they give to the farmers, and that's why it really goes down. If we look at India, again, if we consider the Article 6.2 into this calculation, we can see that India actually should be around 11%, which is the same that Japan, or at least comparable to Japan. So it's something to take into account. Something else that we need to look in domestic support is how developed and developing countries give that support. And in this graph, we see only the three developed countries that we've seen before. And if you can look, the support that developed countries give, it's more product specific. So in the case of the European Union, we can see that 90% goes to product specific domestic support, more than anything concentrated in dairy and wheat. If we look at the US, it is 60%. And it is concentrated in dairy and corn. And if we look at Japan, it's around 80%, and it is concentrated in livestock, in beef and pork as well. This is something interesting that also Joel already showed for the US, that we can see a difference in the trend or the pattern that they have for these non-product specific or product specific after the Farm Bill in 2014. Now they are switching to more crop insurance, which is non-product specific. So that is the change you see in the orange graph. If now we look at developing countries, which in this graph we have exactly the same ones that we talked about, is Brazil, China, and India, we can see that they have a totally different way of how they give the domestic support. And in this case, it's very non-product specific. So Brazil and India, for example, have less than 10% given to product specific, and China is around 20%. Okay, so once that we kind of have the idea of what's going on in the world in terms of domestic support, we need to look at what's going to happen in the next ministerial conference, WTO ministerial conference to be held in Buenos Aires in December of this year. So there are some proposals already presented, some formal proposals presented by less developed countries, another one by Australia and Brazil, and the UAE and Brazil, and India and China, and then also some informal proposals like the one from Japan, Switzerland, and New Zealand. All these have some similarities and the similarities between them, but the three key ideas that they are set it up there is that one set of countries wants to have the existing framework under the WTO as their starting point. Another ones have that to set an overall cap on OTDS. And then the differences between these proposals is what's the definition of OTDS, if it will include the four concepts that we talked about in the previous slides. So it will be include AMS, include de minimis, blue box, and Article 6.2, or just some of those components. And then the other thing is how you measure OTDS. And that will be as a measure of the current value of production or as a fixed period. So it's actually just fixing it in an amount. And then the last point is that they've been discussing our product-specific cuts to avoid concentration. And again, here is how you measure that limit. Is it a percentage of value of production or as a percentage of the whole OTDS? Okay. So given all this that I already mentioned, we ran some scenarios in trying to accommodate all these proposals and what's the world looking in terms of domestic support. And we came up to 4 different scenarios that we think represents the whole range of possibilities that we have in terms of what's the outcome of these proposals if they are actually implemented. So the scenario 1 will be the least ambitious one, and the scenario 4 will be the most ambitious one. And of course, being a scenario 2 and 3 right in the middle. So in scenario 1, we will have the definition of OTDS as only AMS, de minimis, and blue box. And then the OTDS will be measured or expressed as percentage of the value of production. Okay? Then the scenario 2 will be exactly the same one than a scenario 1, but instead of being current value of production, it will be measured as a fixed reference point. And then in scenario 3, we will include a scenario 1, but we also add some product cap to try to avoid the concentration of support in only one commodity. And then the number 4, which is the most ambitious one, it will be the same one than a scenario 2, but we will add the Article 6.2, so that now it will be part of the limit imposed. And then it will be, we will also do a reduction of OTDS over time. Okay? So the first results all these results also, we were using the MIRAGRO-DEP model, which is a global CG model, in which we always run a reference scenario that it will be like the business as usual, so nothing else changes, and that's the line you see over time. And then we compare that line with what happens if something changes. So in this case will be what changes in scenario 1, what changes in scenario 2, and so forth. All the results that I'm going to present here, except this first slide, will be percentage changes with respect of this reference, so to the business as usual. So now starting more with the results, we can see this one here, that it shows the evolution of the OTDS limit in 2025, so at the end of these next 10 years. Here we can see that the main message is that the political space for developing countries is definitely higher in any of these scenarios that we run. China will have the bigger participation, and then the scenarios with a dynamic production, that it will be the scenario 1 and the scenario 3, will allow for the political space to really expand a lot. The other information shown in this graph that it is important to mention is the red bar, which that one shows the bound AMF that we have right now, that actually we'll have in 2025 if there's no new agreement on domestic support. And it is key to notice in the first box, which is the developed countries, that we show that all the scenarios analyzed will deliver lower OTDS limits than the actual bound AMS commitment for developed countries and for also the developing countries that they do have an AMS commitment. Okay. Then to show what's going on, what's going to happen to the world prices under all these scenarios, we can actually see in this one that a scenario 1 and a scenario 2 are very similar, and then the key thing starts when you actually have a product capped. So if we have a limit of how much support you can have per each of the commodities, that's when you really see the biggest changes. We can see that cotton has the biggest ones, followed by wheat and grains. And then we can also notice that the impact on the prices is magnified when the Article 6.2 payments of India are constrained. And that's why you see that the blue line or bar is the one that is always higher, which is the scenario 4. If we want to look at the impact on volume trade, we can see that we see the same pattern that the international prices, where the first 2 scenarios, which is the limits on the OTDS, give the smaller changes compared to the ones where we actually put a product cap. Here again, we see that cotton has the biggest changes of all, and then followed with a lesser degree by wheat, vegetable oil, and wool. And then something here that is also important to notice is the livestock, red meat and white meat, and also sugar, that they can see an increase in trade given the reduction in production in the countries that actually give high levels of domestic support, which creates the need to import to satisfy their own domestic consumption, with imports originating for other countries that produce in a more efficient way. Then if we look at farm production, this is just the farm production, so it does not include the agro-industry. And this will be something to notice between developed and developing countries in the conclusions. But we can see developed countries see a contraction of their farm production, while Russia, India, and China see small gains under all the scenarios, except the scenario 4, when the Article 6.2 starts hitting, and then we see problems in India. And then we see that all developing countries see their agricultural production increasing, and we actually do not see many huge differences between the scenarios for those. Okay? This is just an example for cotton that we wanted just to bring up so that we can see that we see results for all commodities, and we can look into that into more detail if anybody has questions at the end. Okay, so just to conclude, we can see that at a regional level, we see 5 different categories for countries. We see the first one when you have advanced economies with defensive interests like EFTA or Japan, that they have to cut subsidies to replace domestic production, and they need to replace domestic production with imports. We see a second group that they are also advanced economies that have a mixed outcome, with some domestic subsidies reduction, but also they see new market opportunities. This could be the case, for example, of Canada. We have a third category that is also advanced economies, but that they don't have any domestic constraints and can actually benefit from third parties' policy reforms, like the case of Australia. And then fourth, we have developing countries, like the case of Mercosur, that can actually take the advantage of new opportunities on world markets. And then we have a fifth category, they are the net agricultural importing countries that have limited gains in their exports and face also higher world price imports. So the trade volume will be in favor of them, it will increase, but in terms of value, that's when the tricky part kicks in, and some countries will see benefits, some other ones not so much. Another thing we need to look into is the effects that drive these results. And we can see that there are two. One is the terms of trade. And the terms of trade effects will depend directly if they are an exported or if imported, and if they are imported or exported of the commodities that actually see the higher increases in prices. And then the efficiency gains arising from reduced distortions domestically. This last part is very important because there will be some readjustment of factors of production and the use of natural resources in each of these countries that will be going to products or to sectors that they are more efficient or competitive in the world. This could be the cases for EFTA or Japan, and these efficiency gains can counterbalance the negative terms of trade effects that they can see with these reforms. And then another key thing to notice is that when we're talking about domestic support negotiations, for some of the developed countries, it will be hard to talk about this at home because there are some limited economic gains that can be easily outweighed by the political cost. So in these cases, it will be interesting to see the negotiations in domestic support in a broader context to include also market access into this. That way, it will help in increasing the gains from in doing these reforms. Okay. And then just some final consideration before Buenos Aires. It will be key to know what the U.S. position it is in all this. This is the only country that there's really no idea of exactly where or how they are pretending to deal with domestic support in the next ministerial conference. And then message that I want you to kind of keep in mind is that even though these aggregate results that we just reported, they seem to be relatively small, it is still very important to reduce binding in cases of low prices scenarios. If that happens in the near future, it will reduce the ability of the governments to isolate the producers from price signals from the world. And that may contribute to reducing global price volatility. And then the other thing is that it will be very important to define a product cap. We just noticed that that will be the one that will have the biggest effect in terms of prices and also in volume traded. This will generate more efficient use of inputs and natural resources at a global level. And then we also noticed that the most subsidized commodities are meat, dairy products, and cereals, which will be continuous expansion of those, given that now countries have higher incomes, so they will be consuming more every year. So we need to make sure that developing countries can take these new market opportunities for their own. Otherwise, they won't be able to really compete with the other developed countries that really can use a lot of resources in subsidizing their productions. All right, thank you very much.